I'm actually quite humbled that you thought of me to do this. Yeah, it was October 2018 that I stopped. So it must have been in that week that I came to a workshop. But I met your group online, and yeah, I never looked back. I see often on the Sober On-Ramp group, the one common thread that you see there is the fear. People say it's a frightening thought. What is my life going to look like after alcohol? Is it even possible? I distinctly remember that fear, and I'm sure Janet does, and Sue does, and Lynette does. We've all had that fear. I thought about it for a while, and I came upon a writer, a Scottish lady, and she wrote the most beautiful poem about grief. And she said that grief is not your enemy, and you should invite grief in and sit with her and understand her, because you've got to understand that before grief, there was love, and love came first. And that made me think of fear. So if I had to swap the words around and say, I've got to invite fear in and sit with it. I mustn't see it as an enemy. I've got to sit with it, embrace it. And if you can get that, the work starts. Because getting sober is not just ditching the drink. That's just a small part of it. Getting sober is to get to you and to understand you. The fear that kind of runs through your mind is, what's going to be left? If I leave alcohol, what's going to be left? In my case, I had a good couple of friends. I had a huge circle of friends because I played golf, social golf, all heavy drinkers, and I was part of them. I knew I will lose a couple of them along the way. So I'm going to lose some friends. I'm going to not be invited to parties. I'm going to be the dull one. Then I thought, what are you so afraid of? What are you so afraid of that you cannot imagine a life without alcohol? To me, the answer is simply, you are afraid of you. Because when it's all said and done and you ditch the drink, you're going to be left with you. That is when the work starts. Because to understand that fear and to sit with it, you've got to understand yourself. And you've got to understand that the root of it, we all drank for reasons, but that's another common thread. Things happened in our lives, whether it was childhood or whether it was trauma in teenager years, or there was pain involved. And we found that the way out of the pain was alcohol. That became our friend. In my case, I had an extremely low self-esteem. I didn't think much of myself. I could hardly look at myself in a mirror. But boy, when I started drinking, I was the belle of the ball, and all those thoughts were gone, and I quite liked myself. I thought I was hilarious. So now all of that was gone, and now I sit and it's just me and the person in the mirror. That is really when you start the work. Understanding your hurt, your pain, and you've got to start digging there. Now, a lot of people would say, why should we rumble in the past, live in the present, and leave that behind? But unfortunately, a wall was built through the hurt and the fear. A wall was built between you and your growth. And unless you break down that wall bit by bit, I can guarantee you, as the sun comes up tomorrow, if you don't do that work, you're going to eventually turn back to alcohol. So you've got to try and say, okay, so that's it. It's just me. I'm left here, and let's start the work. I think I've spent thousands of rands on psychologists. I went to Lynette, self-help books. I even have a color therapist. I did everything I could. The big thing was to be as honest as I could with myself. And I had to understand another truth, that fear doesn't disappear just because you're sober. Fear will always have a role in your life. So if you can understand yourself and maneuver yourself and sit with fear without turning to alcohol or gambling or overeating or all of those things, you could probably really live a purpose-driven life. I was just saying to Janet before you guys came on, I'm a bit all over the show because my little grandson is in the hospital. He was admitted yesterday. And the fear I have that something's going to go wrong, it is just too terrible. So I had to sit with this fear today and work it and just talk to myself and try and understand where the fear comes from. Unless you start working on yourself, unless you start digging and breaking down the bricks, and it's an ongoing journey. It's not something you're going to do in a day or a month or a year. But if you can start that first brick. I remember maybe a month into sobriety, I was sitting at a stop street waiting for cars, and suddenly a thought hit me about myself. Why don't I like myself? Where's this coming from? It took me back to my past, and then the unraveling started. I had an emotionally abusive grandmother that always made me feel like absolute shit. I was a reader. I loved my school. And in her eyes, she once said to me, a man doesn't want a woman who reads. You must be able to cook and knit and whatever. So I said, you know what, then that's it. Then I ran into trees and I sat in a tree and read to get away from her. But it left such a mark on me. And I had to go back and really look at it. And I'm not lying to you, Janet, and all you guys. I'm 5+ years sober. And it took an event last year, towards the end of last year, when the final penny dropped in terms of starting to like myself. My mother was diagnosed with cancer on the 21st of July. Her last 3 weeks, I've put her in hospice. Unfortunately, a week before she passed, I was diagnosed. I was very ill, and I was diagnosed with bacterial meningitis. And I literally almost died. They wouldn't let me out of the hospital to go and say goodbye to her. I remember one night looking at myself in the mirror in this hospital room, and I saw this bedraggled face sunken from the illness now, and the hairs all over the show. And I said, you're getting a second chance. And the chance is to start liking myself. I've got to love myself, not for anyone else. I always had a bit of long hair to cover my face because I didn't like the acne marks and stuff like that. First thing I did when I left the hospital was cut my hair short. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. So it just shows you that it could take years for bricks to fall. But in that time, it's always a step forward. It's a step towards your spiritual growth, because that is where you're aiming to go. Being sober is not just about being sober. It's about understanding a world where most people run away from. It's to be present, to be with yourself, to be happy with yourself.